Why haven't we returned to the moon? It was July 20th, 1969. The entire world stopped. More than 600 million people were glued to their televisions, watching the most extraordinary moment in human history. Neil Armstrong had just become the first human being to set foot on another world. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, he declared. And in that magical moment, it seemed we had just opened the doors to a new era of space exploration. But here's the great mystery that haunts us to this day. Why did we stop? Think about it with me. Between 1969 and 1972, 12 astronauts walked on the moon. 12! They walked on its surface, drove lunar rovers, played golf up there, collected rocks, conducted scientific experiments. Humanity had conquered the moon. And then, we simply stopped. We turned our backs on our natural satellite and never returned. More than 50 years have passed, half a century. In that time, we created the internet, put computers in the pockets of billions of people, mapped the human genome, developed artificial intelligence. But we didn't go back to the moon. Why? What really happened? Some people whisper dark theories. They talk about mysterious warnings, things that were supposedly seen up there, hidden reasons for never returning. But the truth, my friends, is even more fascinating and complex than any conspiracy theory. Let's start with money. Money. At the height of the Apollo program, the United States was spending about 4% of the entire federal budget on NASA. 4%. Imagine that today. We're talking about billions and billions of dollars invested in rockets, training, research, technological development. It was an astronomical amount, literally. And why were they spending so much? Here's the crucial part that many forget. The space race was never really about science. It was about power. It was about national pride. It was about the Cold War. Go back with me to the 1960s. The world was divided into two blocks. On one side, the United States and its capitalist allies. On the other, the Soviet Union and the Communist bloc. And the two superpowers were in a deadly competition to prove who was superior. When the Soviets launched Sputnik in 1957, it was a shock to Americans. When Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space in 1961, it was a national humiliation for the United States. President J.F. Kennedy knew he needed to do something dramatic. And that's when he made that historic speech, promising that the United States would put a man on the moon before the end of the decade. Not because it was easy, but because it was hard. It was a direct challenge to the Soviets. We are better than you. And it worked. In July 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon while the world watched. The United States had won the space race. Mission accomplished. End of story. But wait, there were still 5 more Apollo missions after that one. Why did they continue if they had already won? Well, the excitement was still high, the program was already underway, and there was much more to discover. But something began to change in the American public consciousness. The Vietnam War was intensifying. Protests filled the streets. Social problems like poverty, racism, and inequality demanded attention. And suddenly, that question began to echo. Why are we spending billions to collect moon rocks when we have so many problems here on Earth? The television audience for Apollo 11 was massive, but when Apollo 13 faced that traumatic emergency in 1970, which could have cost 3 astronauts their lives, most people weren't even watching until the accident happened. The public was losing interest. The novelty had worn off. And then came the final blow. In 1972, Apollo 17 was the last crewed mission to the moon. And when astronauts Eugene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt returned to Earth, they closed a chapter in human history.
Cernan was the last man to walk on the moon. His footprints are still there, preserved in the lunar dust without wind or erosion, and no one has visited them since. The American government canceled the already planned Apollo 18, 19, and 20 missions. The money was cut. NASA had to reinvent itself with a drastically smaller budget, and the moon was forgotten. But here's the really interesting part. Because for decades, the moon remained forgotten but never abandoned in human imagination. And in recent years, something changed. Interest is returning, and it's not just scientific interest or nostalgia. It's something much more powerful. The perception that the moon could be extremely valuable.
Did you know there are resources on the moon that could be worth trillions of dollars? Rare elements like helium-3, which could revolutionize energy production on Earth. Frozen water at the lunar poles, which could be converted into rocket fuel, making the moon a refueling station for more distant missions. Valuable minerals and metals waiting to be exploited. Suddenly, the moon is no longer just a symbol of national achievement. It's an economic opportunity. And when money is involved, things start to move. NASA launched the Artemis program, which promises to take not only men, but also the first woman to the moon in the next decade. China landed probes on the far side of the moon and has ambitious plans to establish a lunar base. India, Russia, private companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin all have their eyes on our natural satellite. We are on the verge of a new era of lunar exploration, but this time, it won't be a race between two superpowers. It will be a race between multiple nations and private companies, all competing for resources, knowledge, and strategic position. And here's the great irony. We stopped going to the moon just when we were beginning to learn how to do it efficiently. The Apollo missions were initial explorations, clumsy first steps. If we had continued, perhaps we would already have permanent lunar bases now, space tourism to the moon, resource mining, telescopes on the far side of the moon where there's no radio interference from Earth. But human history is like that. We advance in spurts, not in straight lines. And perhaps we needed this hiatus, this period of reflection and technological development to return to the moon in a sustainable and permanent way. Because when we return, and we will return, it won't just be to plant a flag and come home. It will be to stay, to build, to transform the moon into humanity's first step in its journey through the solar system. Eugene Cernan's footprints still wait on the lunar surface, preserved for more than 50 years. Soon, they will have company, and this time, we won't leave the moon alone again. Because the real question isn't why we stopped going to the moon. The real question is, what will we do when we return? And the answer to that question will define humanity's future as a spacefaring species. The next chapter of lunar exploration is just beginning, and you, dear viewer, will live to see it. The next footprints on the moon may be made during your lifetime. And who knows, perhaps one day you yourself will look at Earth from that gray and dusty soil. The moon never stopped calling us. It just took time for us to hear the call again. Did you enjoy this video? Leave your like, leave your hype, share and subscribe to the channel. Also, leave your comment about the topic discussed or your suggestion. A big hug and see you in the next video.